I've been reading non-fiction books for nearly 10 years, and in that time I've read north of 400. And in this video, I'm going to give you 16 books that I guarantee you'll have never read that will make you rich. These ones made me rich, and the information in these books I applied to become a multi-millionaire by 26. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first one, and it's a bit of a heavy hitter, is The Campaigns of Alexander by Arrian, or Alexander the Great by Anthony Everett. You need to read Alexander the Great if you're a young man and you want to be successful, because Alexander the Great was one of, if not the most successful 20-year-old in the history of the world. He conquered the Persian Empire, he conquered the known world, and he took 30 or 40,000 Macedonian troops and just basically obliterated an empire and took it over. Now, if you don't know the story of Alexander, then you're missing out on a ridiculous amount of inspiration and knowledge that you could use to succeed. Now, if you are historically inclined and you have some context and you're good at reading history, I would recommend you read The Campaigns of Alexander by Arrian, because this is more of a historical account of the battles and how this worked. However, if you're not historically inclined and you're not too good at reading history and you don't know much, then I would start with this book, which is Anthony Everett's Alexander the Great. It's a lot more straightforward. It reads a lot more like a story than, something like an account of battles. But if I'm ever feeling a lack of inspiration or motivation, I just pick this thing up, and within like 50 pages, I'm back to work and ready to go. Now, the next book is The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. This one is huge. If you don't understand the theory of evolution and the theory of natural selection, you're missing out on a lot of business success and a lot of success in general, because what you need to understand is that when it comes to trying to become successful, you're in a competition and you're against other people. And if you know how nature works and how nature conspires to basically level up certain organisms and certain species, you can apply and reverse engineer that thinking into your business. And so this book here, The Origin of Species and Studying Evolution, has significantly helped me grow my businesses and become successful, because I understand nature and I understand the way the world works, which is basically nature. And Darwin made a wonderful, wonderful account of this in The Origin of Species. And by reading this book, you'll just understand better how the world works. And what you need to realize is that capitalism and business is an extension of biology. And so when we look at biology, we have things like competition, we have all these biological ideas, competition, evolution, etc., etc. And if you know how they work, you know how business works. So I'd recommend you read that. Bit of a hard read once again, but it is worth it. The next one is Socrates by Paul Johnson. This is not a very long book, and the writing isn't that big, so you can read this pretty damn quick. But this is basically a short account of the life of Socrates, the man who basically invented philosophy as we know it. If you don't know the story of Socrates, and it's kind of like with Alexander the Great, you're just missing out on a huge chunk of inspiration and knowledge that you can draw on to apply to your own life and become successful. It's tragic to me that, people go through life and they don't know the story of Socrates, and they don't know how he died, and they don't know how he responded to his death. The ultimate sort of Stoic. What happened after Socrates died is we had this massive renaissance of philosophy where dozens of different philosophical schools and methods of thought came to life, and they all came from the teachings of Socrates. And so you don't have to be a philosopher or read philosophy, but you kind of need to understand it on a level that when you're doing business or when you're trying to become successful, it helps to have a rule book of behavior to pull on, and Socrates kind of wrote that. So I'd recommend that you read that. It's really helpful. Next one is The Prince by Machiavelli. This is once again a very, very short book and can probably be read in 1 or 2 sittings depending on your attention span. This is an incredibly, dark read, because it talks about how to manipulate people. And Machiavelli, I think, wrote this for a specific prince in Florence, or he lived in Florence in 1500 or something. But he wrote this for a guide for a friend or a colleague or something on how to basically run a kingdom or a principal. And it's incredibly manipulative. And what it does is it shows you the true nature of the human beings, and it shows you basically how to manipulate people. And by learning that, first of all, you protect yourself from people who want to manipulate you because you understand the strategies, but it also just reveals to you that it's possible. And whilst I'm not encouraging you manipulate people, it can be quite helpful to understand how to do it, or understand how people can do it to you. And it will give you a lot of indication. For example, in here, he talks about how to deal with flattery and how to flatter someone properly so they like you. pretty dark, pretty Machiavellian, but this is the thing about success in business is we're not looking for these happy-go-lucky positivity books. We want ones that hit hard and tell the truth. And so I like that kind of book. The next one is Letters from a Stoic by Seneca. Seneca was a Roman Stoic philosopher, and he basically wrote letters to friends. And what happened is some absolute legend of an archaeologist or historian found his letters. And Seneca was notoriously Stoic in so far as that he was one of like the leading minds of Stoicism in his age. And bear in mind, his age was like the Roman age, which was the age to be a Stoic. And so in here, you can actually just read personal letters. It's like being able to read imagine being able to read David Goggins' WhatsApp messages. Like, that's kind of the equivalent of being able to read this. It's like someone like David Goggins, someone asked him for advice on how to be like mentally tough or how to be strong. Imagine being able to listen to the voice notes that David Goggins sends to his personal friends on toughness and strength and how to basically be strong. That's the equivalent. Incredible book. I'd recommend you read it. Like the philosophy thing, like everyone thinks that reading philosophy is a waste of time, won't make you money, but ultimately, like when it comes to achievement and success, the only thing you really have is your philosophy. The only thing you have to put on is the rule book of behavior you have, and there's a few more books in there. Now, the next one is Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. This one is a remarkable read because as you build a business or as you try to become successful in a career, and you basically try to grow, you're going to have to deal with people. And everyone these days is focused on IQ and intelligence and being smart. But the thing that goes under the radar is emotional intelligence, or EQ. I would rather have a really high EQ than a really high IQ, because ultimately building things is about dealing with people, reading people, understanding people. And this book here just gives you a really good look into how to become more emotionally intelligent. And it just makes you more aware of emotional intelligence. And it's hard to do justice in a quick 1 minute review, but it will give you a really good idea as to where to start with people, how to deal with them, how to manage them, how to hire them, and as you're going through, what traps to not fall for. Now, this is a really interesting book. It's called The Art of Worldly Wisdom by Baltasar Gracian, who was a Spanish monk, I think in the 1500s or 1600s or something. Now, you've probably never heard of this book before, but you've probably heard of The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. And I read The 48 Laws of Power, and I found out that the majority of the 48 Laws of Power was cited from Baltasar Gracian. Now, not all of it. There's lots of different sources that Robert Greene pulled on, but one book and one guy that is consistently referred to and quoted throughout the 48 Laws of Power and other Robert Greene books is The Art of Worldly Wisdom. So what I like to do when I find a book or an author that I think is really good and that I really like, for example, such as what's it called? Robert Greene, Mastery, Seduction. He's got some amazing books, Robert Greene, and I'd put his books in here only that you might have already read them, and that's against the point of this video. But The Art of Worldly Wisdom is written by Baltasar Gracian, and I think that this guy knew what was up. He knew what was up in terms of power, in terms of manipulation, in terms of, interpersonal social skill, and how to get what you want and how to use other people to get what you want. Once again, this is a dark read. This is not a, power of positivity sort of psycho-cybernetics wonderful thing. This is dark, and it helps to read it because it reveals to you the true nature of humanity. And I'd recommend that you study it because, well, that's kind of where Robert Greene got a lot of his Machiavellian ideas from for the 48 Laws of Power and those sorts of books. Now, this one, you may have heard of this one. You probably haven't. It's The Hypomanic Edge by John D. Gartner. This book is basically about a genetic condition called hypomania, which is a incredibly common trait among incredibly successful people. And so when I read biographies of leaders like Napoleon, Caesar, Alexander the Great, for example, the people who lead empires and stuff, one thing that they're consistently described as in the books is energetic. And all these business people I study, these billionaires, they're consistently described as these energetic people who are restless and cannot stop working. And what you want to learn how to do is how to become that, because it's impossible to get rich if your energy is low, right? And so by reading The Hypomanic Edge, you get an indication and a sort of inkling into basically all these people. So like in here, for example, it explains how like Christopher Columbus, Alexander Hamilton, Andrew Carnegie, like all of these incredibly successful people, there's lots of different ones in here. it will explain basically where they got their energy from and how they sustain their energy. And it's really inspiring, and I'd recommend you read it, because if your energy is low, getting rich is really tough. Hopefully when you read this, you'll resonate with it, because you want to be this kind of person that is consistently restless and just wants to get things done and has tons of energy. It's a pretty good trait to have if you want to be successful. Now, this one is a really cool book called Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. I read this one when I was, I think, 18 or 19, and this is a little bit more of a, you can see in here there's some diagrams and stuff, it's a little bit more of a practical book. Thinking in Systems basically explains how systems work. You might think to yourself, why the hell do I need to know what thinking in systems is, and why the hell do I need to know how a system works and how feedback loops work, and surely isn't that just for like engineers and stuff? But trust me, if you want to build a company and you want to get rich by doing your own thing, you need to systemize your business. You need to have predictable, reliable, repeatable, consistent processes that basically take inputs and process outputs. And like, for example, a sales system or a onboarding system or a marketing system or a product system. You need to have systems for these things. And the best book I've ever found on building systems and scaling systems is Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. Donella Meadows kind of almost invented the field. She wrote the book, so to speak, on the actual game of systems. And, this is basically the book that is that. And it's really awesome. And it talks a lot about, it's kind of boring to read if you're not like into it. But I found this really interesting, and it talks about inflows, outflows, taps, pipes, like how systems actually work. And if you don't know why you need to read about systems, just trust me that you do and go and do it, because you'll see when you come to build a business that it's all about just having systems in place. Now, this one is, once again, a very dark book. This is by Freud. So like, the kind of the pretty big deal, founding father of psychology. Civilization and its Discontents. I read this when I was like 18, and it kind of rocked my world a little bit. Pretty short book. You can read this in one sitting if you wanted to, but a very deep book, and I'd recommend you read it multiple times. Once again, like I think you're kind of getting to start to realize here that I'm not recommending you books on money or business. I'm recommending you books on peripheral disciplines that can be applied to business. Because if you understand psychology and if you understand things like the human mind, when you come to deal with it, whether it's your own or other people's, when you're managing them or trying to sell them, you can reverse engineer all this knowledge to make money. Because really, how do you make money? Well, you have to, people have to buy from you. And so the first principle of making money is human exchange. Because if you want to make money, someone has to buy from you, and a human has to buy from you. And so if you understand how humans work and how their minds work, then not only can you manage your own, but you can manage theirs. And it makes the whole transition in the exchange of making money incredibly simple, incredibly straightforward, and I'd recommend you read that. Now, this next one is by Robert Greene, but a lesser known book of his that you may not have read called The 33 Strategies of War. This basically goes into a series of historical accounts of different wars and different battles, and how leaders and generals of those battles manipulated situations and made decisions to win them or lose them, and you can learn from their defeats. This is an incredibly useful book specifically for business, because it teaches you leadership, it teaches you strategic thinking, it teaches you how to basically plan, and I'd recommend you read it. Once again, it's a book of history. I think what you're kind of starting to realize this by now. Like, if you want to get rich and if you want to make money, it's not about reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad or Cash Flow Quadrant or anything like that. It's about finding people that have crushed something and reverse engineering how they did it into your life. Because the thing about all of these common books, like the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, the like what's that one by Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich, these are all good books objectively, but the thing is everyone's read them and everyone's poor. So there's an indication there that the knowledge contained in those books just doesn't work, or at least isn't enough for you to push forward and grow. And I've read all those books and they've been useful to me, but you need to go a little bit further afield if you want to actually get an advantage. Now, next one is once again a very small book called Managing Oneself by Peter R. Drucker. Peter Drucker is a lecturer, or was a lecturer, I'm not sure if he has anymore, for the Harvard Business Review. I don't think he's a lecturer for Harvard Business Review, rather, but he writes for Harvard Business Review, or did. And this is a quick article that he wrote on how to manage yourself and how to basically hold yourself accountable in terms of your relationships, in terms of your behavior. Really good book for managers, for people who struggle with discipline or keeping themselves going. So I'd recommend you read this. I read this when I was 19, 20. Not in 1920, I'm not that old. But yeah, really good book, Managing Oneself. This is one you can just read real quick, one that you have to read multiple times to really kind of get to the hang of it. And they're not even, like, you can get this thing done real quick. So I'd recommend you read it. This is a tough read. The Undiscovered Self by Carl Jung. Now, Carl Jung, like Freud, is one of the founding fathers of modern psychology. Specifically, this guy looked into the unconscious. Carl Jung is probably one of the most influential figures in my life in terms of reading. I've read lots of his books. The problem is they are near impossible to read if you're not versed in the lingo or the language of his time and psychology. If you pick up, he's got multiple books. One's called like Psychology and Alchemy. He's got one on like the collective unconscious. There's a book called The Red Book, which is one of Carl Jung's books. They are near impossible to read if you don't get them. And so don't if you want to read Carl Jung, which you should, I would recommend you start here because this is like a gateway to Carl Jung's understandings of the unconscious. Why would you want to read the unconscious is a good question that you might be asking yourself, because it's pretty easily summarized. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. And that's a quote from Carl Jung. If you don't know who you are, then you don't know where you're going, if that makes sense. Because the idea that Carl Jung had is that you're basically you as an individual entity, as a human, are a collection of personas, and those personas, they all have their own needs, wants, desires, and emotions, and they pull you in different directions. And so if it's ever felt like you're trying to battle yourself on the way to success, and you go up and down, it's because your unconscious is playing mind tricks on you. And until you understand how that thing works, and you understand how to integrate it into your consciousness, it's going to just take you all over the place and lead you astray, and you're going to get in trouble. So good place to start with understanding how to deal with that horrible thing, or that difficult thing, is The Undiscovered Self. This is a really short book on Jung's writings, and it basically just gives you a pretty nice, simple look into, it's an introduction to studying the unconscious. And I'm not going to recommend any of other Jung's books to you until you have read lots of, you need to really read more of the modern psychology books before you dive into Jung, because Jung was the foundation of psychology, with obviously the exception of Freud. I think Jung learned from Freud a lot. So really great book, and I'd recommend you read it. Now, next one is Andrew Carnegie by David Nasaw, or Nasaw. Now, you don't have to read Carnegie, but what I'd recommend that you do is I'd recommend that you pick one 1800s American magnate or tycoon to study. Now, this could be Andrew Carnegie, it could be Vanderbilt, it could be Rockefeller, it could be Gold, it could be Morgan, JP Morgan, Jay Gold, etc., Cornelius Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller. There's 5 or 6 dudes in just after the American Revolution in the mid to late 1800s that became the richest men in America. Think like PayPal mafia, but after the Industrial Revolution, or during the Industrial Revolution. And they were basically kind of like the first proper wave of international millionaire entrepreneurs. Okay, billionaires didn't exist back then because the inflation was too low. So Andrew Carnegie was, I think when he was like 60 or 50, he was worth like $20 million, which obviously today is a lot. But anyway, I like Andrew Carnegie. I like his philosophies. He's got a really good series of essays called The Gospels of Wealth, which are quite cool to read. But Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gold, or JP Morgan. Pick one of those guys and study them relentlessly. I'm studying them all because, I want to read all of them. But you want to have one of these OG tycoon magnate figures that you look up to, that you can draw knowledge from in your life. And at the moment, I think Carnegie is probably the best one for you to start with. This is a difficult read. It's a very detailed read. It's 800 pages long and the text is pretty small. So, if you're dopaminergically inclined to be chaotic, it's going to be a tough one for you. But I like reading because it teaches you to focus and think. So, yeah. Pick a tycoon from the 1800s because they kind of invented modern business strategy. Like before them, there were still merchants and there were still business people, but the Industrial Revolution kind of gave rise to the idea of an international entrepreneur, and people existed before then. Like in ancient Rome, you had people like Crassus, who was the richest man. So businessmen have always existed, but the cool thing about the guys from the 1800s is their lives were so perfectly and they were so documented in terms of detail because you've got photographs, you've got letters, you've got telegraphs, you've got they've got newspapers as well in the press. We don't have that luxury from anything going back from like the 1600s, but these guys, their lives are so detailed and you can pull so much wisdom and knowledge. When you're reading, and I'll tell you that in a second after this last book, this is my favorite book of all time. And it's an honorable mention. It's called Discourses by Epictetus. Funnily enough, it's actually written by Arrian, the same guy who wrote The Conquest of Alexander. He was a Roman historian or a Greek historian. He was Roman. No, he was Greek. No, he was Roman. I don't know. Anyways, matter. You can see I've been through this one quite a lot. I've read this book, I don't know how many times now, but it's kind of beaten. Epictetus, Discourses. This is a account of... Epictetus didn't write this book, but Arrian did. And Arrian was one of his students. So Epictetus lectured in antiquity. He had like a lecturing hall and like a school of philosophy for Stoicism. And Arrian, Epictetus was what we would call an orator, which means he didn't write things down like Socrates. And so what we have here a transcription of his speeches, basically. And this book is... basically, it makes me feel safe because this is like a guidebook for life in terms of philosophy, in terms of how to be strong and tough and how to be resilient and how to not let things get to you and how to control your emotions, how to control your impulses. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book. Once again, it's a tough read, but once you've read it once, like you can go back through it and you'll pick up 100 things you didn't realize. And I still reread this thing from time to time, and there's stuff in there that I missed at the beginning or didn't remember. Now, I'll leave you with this in closing. When you're reading, you're either reading for one of two things. You're reading for knowledge or you're reading for wisdom. Knowledge is something that you look to acquire to help you solve an immediate problem. And so if you're trying to build a company or a career or a business, and one thing that you're struggling with is sales or getting job interviews or running specific types of ads, you need knowledge to solve those problems. And so what you want to do when you're reading is you want to look for books that either give you knowledge or wisdom. And you need knowledge if you have a problem that you don't know how to solve. But you need wisdom if you don't know what decisions to make and how to make decisions properly. Because knowledge is what we use to make decisions. Wisdom is how we make them, if that makes sense. And the reason that I like to study a huge broad range of disciplines and read lots of history, lots of biographies and stuff, is because I get to learn wisdom. I get to learn from people. And in my experience, if you have wisdom and if you have all of these accounts of different disciplines and all these accounts of people that have done different things and lost different things and won different things, making decisions becomes incredibly easy. And you get to sort of your mental comprehension mechanism for decision making becomes sharp and dangerous. And that's the thing that makes you successful. It's not about having all this stuff that you've learned that you can execute on. It's about reading lots of different things and lots of different people, and then having this what we would call lattice work of a brain, where you can pull something from biology here, you can pull this thing from history here, you can pull this thing from Stoicism here, you can pull this thing from Jung here, from Freud here, from Darwin here, from Socrates here. Like, the point of this video is the majority of the books that I've just mentioned, 80% of them are about great people. And if you study great people, you can learn how they became great and reverse engineer the things that made them do that and allow them to do that, and it will make you successful. So those are the 16 books that I'd recommend if someone was starting out and wanted to be rich that they haven't read before. Have a good day.